Scientific Director for the BC Support Unit, which is part of Canada's strategy for patient-oriented research, and a professor at the School of Population and Public Health at the University of British Columbia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the beautiful land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So we're here to talk about connecting the dots, essential elements of an efficient health technology assessment ecosystem. And we're doing something a little different in this plenary session. So we're having no PowerPoint slides. So who feels good about no PowerPoint slides? Good, so am I. And we've got a fabulous panel of speakers. The other thing that we're doing that's different is that we have a graphic recorder who is going to be in real time providing a visual representation of the conversation that is had that we can then share subsequently. So I'd like to acknowledge and say a big thank you. I mean, I can't believe that someone is willing to do such a task, but Tanya Gadsby is our graphic recorder. Tanya is actually at the back, so please, and then and we'll have that, and hopefully that is going to stimulate ideas and comments and questions that that people have. One of the things that someone said to me when they saw the fireside chat arrangements is that I hope that people are not going to mumble into the microphone. So we've asked our speakers to make sure that they do not mumble into their microphones and speak clearly. And we're going to structure the session as around 3 questions which relate to the overarching theme. So let me introduce our panelists. So we have Nicholas Brooke, who is a caregiver and also the founder and executive director of the Synergist Patient-Focused Medicines Development, and he joins us from Belgium. And that is a collaboration platform incubator that brings key players together with the express aim of solving significant societal problems. So we're expecting a lot, especially because he's an economist as well, which is fabulous. I always think you can't have too many economists on the platform, so great that we've got at least 2, possibly even 3. So the second panelist is Dr. Maureen Ryan. Maureen is the Director of Health Technology Assessment and the Deputy Chief Executive Officer for Health Information and Quality Authority in Ireland. She's also an assistant professor of pharmacoeconomics, very good, at Trinity College Dublin, and Maureen and her team conduct health technology assessment. Our third panelist is Dr. Alicia Granados, and Alicia is the head of Global HTAi and Scientific Strategy at Sanofi Genzyme in Spain. And Alicia has had more than 27 years. I've actually stopped including the number of years in my bio to be honest, but she's willing to admit that she's had more than 27 years of experience in healthcare, public and private policy and strategy development, with a particular focus on HTAi. And worthy of note is that she was responsible for the creation and management of the Catalan Agency for Health Technology Assessment. And then finally, we've got Dr. Robin Lim. So Robin is the Senior Science Advisor for Health Products and Food Branch at Health Canada. Robin works to enable scientifically and socially responsible, patient-focused and life cycle approaches for therapeutic product development. So I'm sure you will agree, join me in agreeing that we have a fabulous panel to close our conference, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say. So just by way of setting the scene, I wanted to put a shout out to CADTH's new strategic plan, which has a particular focus on health technology management. So the new HTAi is HTM. So there we are. So what does that mean? It means that we're going to have more of a focus on life cycle approaches from the early development of technologies through to the adoption of technologies, real-world performance of technologies, and then crucially, the disinvestment in technologies at the end of their life cycles. So I think that's a very encouraging strategic direction that's being taken in Canada, and I know that similar emphasis is elsewhere. And another particular emphasis in the CADA strategic plan is their stakeholder engagement. And I think that's one of the things that we can draw upon in this session, especially the patient focus and the patient emphasis, and a lot of discussion in this conference around that. So we're looking for an efficient health technology management or health technology assessment system that provides high quality and avoids waste. And our panelists are going to give us the answers to how we're going to achieve that, which is great. What I'm going to ask people to do just to start with, we don't have the title. So the title is, we do have the title, good. Okay, so essential elements of an efficient HTAi ecosystem. So I want everyone to stand at this point, please. And no one can remain seated. Please, everyone must stand at this point. And then please sit down if you think we have a disastrously inefficient HTAi ecosystem currently. You can sit down now if you think we have a disastrously inefficient HTAi ecosystem. Wow. Okay, so the next one, you can sit down if you think we have a moderately inefficient HTAi ecosystem at this point. Okay, that sort of gives us a sense of the feeling in the room, and I guess it gives us a sense that this is an important topic that we need to get right. So the way we're going to structure the session is that we're going to have 3 questions, and our panelists are going to have a very short period of time to respond to each question, and we will then have an opportunity for open discussion and dialogue. We'll do it mainly after the 3 questions have been addressed by the panelists, but if anyone feels the need to share an insightful and profound comment or question, then we can accommodate that as well. But it must be insightful and profound. So we'll wait and see whether we get such a question or comment. So we're going to start with the first question, which is, what do we mean by an efficient HTAi ecosystem? So what does that term mean to you? And we're going to start with Maureen. Thank you.
Thanks, Sterling. Well, I suppose as a HTAi doer, when I was asked to think about this, my natural default was to take a HTAi approach to the assessment of the ecosystem as a health-improving intervention. And I think that means that we have to see how can the ecosystem be organised so that we maximise population health, we maximise the benefits for individual patients, and we do that then in the context of the fixed resources we have. So the economist to me is coming out there for you. So I think to achieve that, what it means is that each of the HTAi actors has to have maximising health outcomes for people as their primary motivation. And they have to make their own choices about how they allocate their own scarce resources informed by that motivation. And now I do realise, obviously, that decision-making is messy, and it's multifactorial. But if we have an efficient HTAi ecosystem, then what that means for a researcher is that when they select the topics that they are going to use their own scarce intellectual capacity to address, they pick ones that will drive better outcomes for people, while still considering the other issues like, is this an interesting question for me to think about, and will I get my work published? Or if you're a patient group, you need to work with the other HTAi actors, I think, to find out to hone in on those points in the HTAi process where the patient's invaluable but scarce expertise can really add the most value, because I think it's not about tokenism, it's about maximising the value add. And then for me at this conference, my take-home message from the first plenary was that I working as a HTAi doer in a public agency, we need to think about ourselves as a HTAi intervention. We need to deliver value for money, for the taxpayers' money, to the best of our ability. And I think for me that means I need to think more about what I'm now calling for myself risk-based health technology assessment. So about focusing our HTAi resources so we deliver the best value. So for me that means with priority setting, it means picking the topics where without the HTAi advice there's a high risk of it being the wrong decision, or there's a high risk associated with the wrong decision. And then when it comes to actually doing the HTAs, it's about tailoring the products and the robustness of the evidence synthesis, the rigor of the evidence synthesis, so that it's sufficient in every circumstance, but that we're not using more resources than we need to. I think it makes sense that we target the really comprehensive, robust evidence synthesis to the highest risk decisions. We do that, it makes sense, it's efficient, but it also frees up our capacity to do more. So I think the HTAi ecosystem, we have the resources and we have the intellectual capacity to make it a really efficient system, and I think the way to do that is for us to focus on the primary motivation being improving health for people.
Great, thank you very much. So we're going to head to the end of the panel now. So Alicia.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm so glad to be here and the opportunity. Well, for me, an efficient HTAi ecosystem is those who is able to respond timely and appropriately to the uncertainties that a specific healthcare system may have. And for me, it could be even more than this in terms that HTAi can be really a driver of the efficiency of the healthcare ecosystem itself. So for doing that, of course, up to now, HTAi has been reacting to innovation, and we understand it is efficient when the priorities, as Ronit was saying, are set and clear and transparent. But also for me, it's very, very important that the methodologies are there to respond the real uncertainties, that the question come first to the methodology. Sometimes we are talking about methodologies, real-world data, randomized control trial, and for me it's fundamental to be efficient is to be clear what is the question we are trying to respond. Of course, transparency and inclusiveness, I think we will deal with this later on, what means inclusiveness in this process. But I insist, being reactive is a way, but I think also being proactively involved in development, it will contribute to the efficiency not only of the HTAi ecosystem, but to the efficiency of the healthcare ecosystem, including healthcare. That means including evidence generation plans of developers. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Now we're going to go to Nicholas.
So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So what for me makes an efficient ecosystem, and I'll come to the HTAi part a bit later, is how integrated, coherent, and cohesive is the ecosystem. And so I'm working with patient-focused medicine development, PFMD, and actually when you look at patient engagement across the life cycle of medicine, in our case, medicine development, it's obvious that it's not integrated, coherent, and cohesive. And so this activity that we follow across the life cycle of medicine is really demonstrating that. So PFMD has been created 2 years ago because actually, despite the willingness to make patient engagement happen, there is a lot of fragmentation. And so you have pockets of excellence, of pockets of good practices in different organizations, in different regions, in different diseases. But actually, it's far from being systematic. And so what we aim at is to make patient engagement systematic as a collaborative platform. We've just released a publication 2 days ago with our stakeholders where we actually did a survey to understand the expectation from each stakeholders vis-à-vis of others in terms of patient engagement. And so there is a clear lack of leadership in that field. So only collaboration will get us through to together to make patient engagement happen is one of the key conclusions of that publication. So we went for a systematic approach together. So we first look at the whole landscape, so literature review, surveys, mapping of all the initiatives, all the experts, all the resources about patient engagement. We have Synapse for patient engagement available online. It's a dynamic mapping that you can continue to contribute to. And from there, we co-created the agenda with all stakeholders. And so we are developing guidance. So we have just issued 2 weeks ago the guidance for quality patient engagement, which is 7 dimensions. So for whatever activity, we have listed 150 activities so far you can do in terms of patient engagement. For whatever activity, actually, you should make sure you respect the 7 dimensions. And now we have to define the priorities in terms of what activities we want to develop, specific modules to develop on top of this guidance. So we are building together patient engagement. And I bring back this question of the HTAi ecosystem. And so for me, given the raison d'être of the HTAi player in the healthcare system, I think you are the closest to making the whole system efficient and not only the HTAi activity efficient. And so I think that there is a very much an introvert activity when we talk about efficiency, and I think there is a much bigger role to talk about the whole life cycle and to go out as the actor of efficiency in the system. And taking from there, I'm dealing with all stakeholders, and none of the stakeholders are very far away in the innovation adoption curve. Actually, everybody is stuck just before the early majority phase. And so that's a problem that I can see with all stakeholders. And so maybe if I can just have a call to action, you have the champions in HTAs. You have Ken, Tammy in CADAT. You have Karen and Neil in HTAi. You have the champion. But just you are the early majority. And so you have to help them. You have to embrace what they bring to the table. That's one, and then go, don't focus on your community only, focus on the entire healthcare system. That's how we'll make the whole system much more efficient. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. And then finally we go to the regulator perspective, Health Canada. So Robin, what would be your definition of an efficient HTAi ecosystem?
Well, perhaps in true regulatory style, I'll slightly sidestep that question because I will make it very clear that I'm not an HTAi, as you've heard, and I'm also not an economist, so please don't throw things at me for that. You know, in addition to doing what I'm doing the last few years, I did do 10 years in drug review itself, so did a lot of evidence assessment myself, and I think some of the things I'm going to say echo a lot of what has been said already on this panel, but to me, having had to sort of be a meta-reviewer for 10 years as a regulator, I'd like to think that an efficient ecosystem, and I'm defining that more broadly, which of course would include as a critical component the HTAi, is one which can successfully align and streamline the collective to the fundamental collective objective, which is, as I think we've already heard, optimize patient outcomes and optimize health system outcomes. So if we can streamline and understand what that collective goal is, that helps to trim the avoidable problems, including, and I'm echoing back to plenary session 1, avoidable problems including uncertainty of many kinds, not to mention in the evidence, to minimize the unnecessary replications of work. And I truly do believe, though, that what we all do in our own little sectors is applied science in its own right, and so having replicatable science is a useful thing. But again, there's a sweet spot about not enough and too much. So what that is, I'm not sure where the sweet spot is, but we need to think about that. And the third would be to manage for, I mean, we need to have us all talking together. I completely agree, but I think we've all heard in the last few days that we need to also watch for overabundant interactions, where it can just start to get just downright ungainly, rather than, you know, really hit what we really need. So I was really pleased to see that quote by Doug Altman on day 1 about doing it right. And, you know, I was looking him up actually since that, so that was a wonderful thing to learn about. And he said we need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons. So if we could come up with an ecosystem that can prompt for those things to get us echoing the question of this, what are your critical questions? what do you need, you know, who's asking them, when do you need the answers, and how can we make sure they get answered? To prompt for that, that will ultimately help give you an efficient ecosystem across the board.
Great, thank you very much. So I find this a fascinating conversation because it's like looking into what we do and saying, can we actually apply the principles that we advocate others should adopt ourselves? So can we actually think about efficiency questions, quality questions, avoiding waste in what we do as analysts, as HTAi folks? And I think that's a really interesting challenge. I remember being told about something called the value of analysis. So it's an analysis of the value of doing analysis. And I actually think that's a really quite a profound sort of thought process to go through. So what is the value? Let's analyze the value of doing our work. And sometimes, in fact, I suspect quite a lot of times, and in fact, like you sort of agreed in the voting that you did, that maybe we've got a problem. Maybe we are actually doing things that aren't necessarily delivering value in terms of the analysis that we do. I know that's like sort of quite a, I'm not going to point any fingers. I don't know who's thinking like, you know, is he thinking of me? But I think that's an important question. So we're going to allow, so folks who've got profound and insightful contributions, and maybe allow 2 people to make those contributions now. Please go to the microphones. Does anyone have anything they want to add in terms of what we mean by an efficient HTAi ecosystem? Does anyone want to, sorry, maybe I've set the bar too high. It doesn't have to be like super profound. Thank you.
I'm keeping the bar low.
Please introduce yourself. And
my name is Rob Whitemore, Robodio & Co. The thought that's coming to my head is that it's about doing the right things and everything we've said, but I think it's also at the right time.
Yeah.
And I think if it's all about early access, early adoption, and debunking some of the early stuff, but then having the follow-up, which will enable the more rigorous evaluation, to me, maybe having steps might be a more efficient way of doing this, rather than trying to do it all up front.
Okay, great. Now that's very helpful. All right, last one is here.
Oh,
so
last
is this
word.
super profound or just profound?
It's probably not profound at all.
Okay.
So my name is Randy Gilbel from the University of Alberta. I'm a computing scientist. It baffles me how health technology assessment is dealt with separately than healthcare delivery. And I have this dream about a health learning system where all of the data goes in, it's continuously analyzed, and it always comes back in a short loop or a long loop to change clinical practice. And health technology assessment actually goes away because it's integrated into the whole scheme of things. So we have a health
think that is
system.
pretty profound, actually. I think like thank you very much. Framing HTAi and health technology management as part of what we're talking about as learning health systems, I think is something that we do need to reflect upon, and can we move that forward.
It's a big challenge because there's so many policy jurisdictions.
Okay. We'll carry on the conversation. Thank you. Good. So let's move to our second question. So for those who are thinking, actually, like, I had something I wanted to say, then like you'll get a chance. You will make sure that there are opportunities. So the second question that we're going to go to is, who needs to be involved in this ecosystem and why? So I didn't actually, I added and why. So the panelists actually, sorry, I didn't fully articulate the question previously. So who needs to be involved in this ecosystem and why? And how do we make sure that we're avoiding just wasting people's time by just bringing everyone together for every meeting and everything that we think has to happen? Sorry, that was a bit of editorializing on my part, the last part. But yeah, who needs to be involved in this ecosystem and why? And why don't we go in reverse order? So Robin, would you like to start us off?
Thank you, Sterling. I'm going to frame it as, instead of the people, I'd like to sort of do it by the definition of the roles and responsibilities of the who and the why. One way to sort of chunk it out would be, you're going to need the evidence makers at the table. And we could start to map out who those really are. I mean, I guess one of the obvious players is the industry, but there's researchers outside the industry as well, especially when you think across the life cycle. And again, patients are part of the evidence makers, obviously. So I think if you think about the evidence makers and map out who they really are and which players are critical when, they're ones to involve. Another one, of course, would be the formal assessment makers as opposed to the evidence makers. And I guess that would include, you know, people like me, the regulator, as well as the HTAi or the HTMs. I really like that, by the way. It's a great, I think, progression of the concept. Payers and others who are also making those sorts of formal assessments, whether it's for an actual decision that they make or for the decisions of others as a recommendation. And third is, again, I mean, people have heard this one, but, you know, would be involving the decision makers. But that's that broadest scope of decision making, and that can include the people we've just discussed as well, but, you know, all the way down through making the evidence, licensing, reimbursement, and use, which is a slightly different, even within those stakeholder sectors, you might have different sets of people that you would be including. Maybe the evidence makers who are patients would be one set to involve earlier on about what questions and how to ask them and design your studies around how to answer those. But the ones at the other end who are having to make the decision about whether to use it, maybe a slightly different subset. I don't know, I put that out as a question. So I'm not sure, did I give you both the who and the why? I hope so.
Yep, that's great. Thank you very much. So we'll go to Nicholas.
So to build on my approach from earlier, it's not like in who should be involved in HTAi activities, but who should be involved in the life cycle of medicine development. And just to give an example of a lack of efficiency of the system altogether, when we discuss about unmet needs, it was a topic of discussion in the last few days. And actually the question that HTAi asked is the exact same question than the researcher would ask to understand how they should prioritize the research. And actually, even if what you would do is completely different, asking the question 5 times during the life cycle of medicine development to the patient is completely inefficient. And so who should be at the table? I think everybody with a completely different role, a completely different input at the different phase, but there is no way or no reason to ask twice the same question. And if we want to be efficient, we should start to identify what's the common base and then build on the difference after. And for the moment, we just build on the difference. And so that's what I suggest we should change.
Great, thank you very much. Alicia?
Yes, well, I can echo Robin's words, of course, but let me just add a few things. Starting by researchers, whether are in industry or in academia. And I think even researchers need to change the way of the mindset, because the patients should be in the mind of the researcher more often. And I mean in both researchers in industry and researchers in the academia. So patients and researchers are starting from the very beginning, talking a little bit more. And of course then the process of licensing, evaluating. What I like the most is my recent experience I have in an IMI project, which is a public-private partnership in Europe. It was called Adapt Smart, that we were reflecting on how multi-stakeholder dialogues early in development could help in optimizing research development, licensing, and HTAi, and finally even life cycle. I think theoretical, it was really attractive, really appealing. No? I think there are some practicalities issues, but the concept of adaptive mindset, which means sit together from the beginning, think about the pros and cons, be open in the strength of the evidence, try to find solutions, how could be the additional evidence generation that could solve the uncertainties, not all the uncertainties, because we all have different type of uncertainties. So I like it a lot. I will see how it happens. I think still we are in the very immature process development for this, but I think it's the future. Adaptive mindset, meaning talking together for the very beginning in the evidence generation until the life cycle, I think this is the way, and this is the why, and this is the who. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So we'll go to Maureen.
And of course, I agree with the other speakers, but then just to add a little bit more emphasis, I too actually think that the academic researchers have a really important role to play at this particular point in time. I think we've got a number of challenges now. We have adaptive pathways, which have obvious benefits, but they also mean that we're trying to assess evidence that we're not absolutely sure what the best approach to assessing it is, so we need help with figuring that out. We also need to figure out how we can best use the opportunities with machine learning in terms of, applying it for evidence synthesis and so on. So I think like our academic HTAi experts, working with experts from other fields, such as the last contributor, I think, you can really show us the way forward, and you might maybe have something to add on that yourself, considering your own background. But then I think one group of people that we really do need to pay a lot more attention to are the general public and the politicians who serve them. So I was quite struck yesterday by what Joshua said, the insights he gave us from the time that he spent working with politicians and the difficult decisions that they have to make. And I think we really have to work hard to make sure that our outputs are in an accessible form for politicians, that we communicate them well, and even more than that, that we work with the general public so that they understand the outputs of what we're producing. We've had an example in Ireland in the last month or so with a health crisis and major development, I suppose, of public opinion framed by both traditional media but also particularly by social media, putting immense pressure on the politicians to respond. And in the wake of that, we lost the clinical director of our cancer screening services, the executive director of the cancer screening services, and our national director general for the health services. So I think it's a really important time that we work to understand the value of the communication with politicians, with the general public, and that we harness that so that we achieve the objectives of our work.
Wow, very insightful and profound comments. Thank you very much. So I do think that I would sort of, I think I said yesterday, if you open me up, you see the word scarcity. Like economics is like just runs through my lifeblood because of my training. So I think like avoiding waste is central to what we need to do. So I think like bringing all stakeholders in is critical. But like having all stakeholders involved in all aspects of the work we do, I think takes us into a place where we might be thinking about inefficiency and waste. And I think that's, for me, is like something that we need to think long and hard about. So I want to listen effectively to the voices, particularly of those people with lived experience with the conditions in question. I think like that, for me, is the most important voice to hear. But I don't think we need to, or we should, we need to think about how do we actually do that in an efficient way with all stakeholders. So, great. Okay, so we're still at the point where if you have a profound and insightful comment to make, then you could make this comment in relation to who needs to be involved in the ecosystem. So we have one person who's got a profound and insightful comment. Excellent. Ed.
No pressure, thank you. Ed Wilson, University of Cambridge in England. I think it's really a question, I've got a case study of different agencies working together. Is in the NHS in England, we've got the NIHR, the National Institute for Health Research, which is top sliced from NHS funding. And this actually relates to, Sterling, your comment about value of analysis, which I know as value of information analysis, which is where you actually look at, it's efficient research design, basically. So within a health technology assessment, by that I mean specifically the economic evaluation component, the decision model that goes into it, you can both use that to inform the adoption decision as to whether we should allow this new, whether it's value for money to adopt this treatment. But you can also use that to work out the uncertainty from that to see whether it's worth doing research and is it efficient to do research to actually reduce that uncertainty as well.
Great.
So it brings those two together.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, we'll take a question and we will come to this one, but please be brief because we need to move on. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Gert-Jan van der Wild from the Netherlands. As you said, involving people with lived experience in your HTAi, you are likely to end up with different questions as to when you started with. Yeah. You are going to consider different types of solutions, different outcomes, and different ways of collecting the evidence. So I would say anyone who is likely to bring a new and interesting perspective on these issues should be involved. And
Okay.
I think it very much is in line with what Alicia just said. It's technology assessment as a learning from each other.
Okay, great, thanks. So we're going to take the one last point, sorry, and we're not going to be able to take any more just at now. We will come back to have more comments later. Please.
Shamila from the Osvaldo Cruz Foundation from Brasilia. It's just that, well, I'm a science technology studies researcher and I've been in this field for a year, but it brings me to mind that it will be interesting to know and learn more, because the narrative that everyone has been putting here is that involvement should be as early as possible, and then perhaps it's a good way to enhance the whole HTAi ecosystem as a more effective ecosystem if you decentralize HTAi. And a very interesting way of doing this is the concept of citizen science that's been happening for quite some time. And during the workshop on patient involvement, the guy from Patients Like Me gave a beautiful example of how to do it. So perhaps we should be looking at what citizen science is doing.
Citizen science, excellent. I think that is a profound and insightful comment, so thank you very much. I think we do need to think about citizen science and what exactly that means and what the implications of that are for health technology assessment. So we're going to move on to our third question, which is, I think, the most interesting and challenging question, which is, how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be? So what does the journey look like? Because I think, I remember Stephen Lewis, the health policy consultant from Saskatoon, telling me that he's sick of seeing high-performing healthcare systems. He's like been to see so many high-performing healthcare systems. What he wanted to know was how Canada could move from where we are currently to there. It's the journey that we need to understand rather than the destination. And I think like now we've at least given a sense of what the destination we might want to aim for. We need to then understand, what does that journey look like? How could we actually move in that direction? And we're going to ask our panelists to reflect on that question. But before we do that, I want everyone to stand up again, please. And just raise your hands above your head. And then sit down again. Good. Okay. I think that's gonna help with like focus and concentration as we move to the third question. So, how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be? And we're going to split this into the phases of life cycle of technologies. So we're going to look first at early development, then at early advice, then at the adoption, real-world performance, and disinvestment. So we're going to sort of go through that sort of structure that's about the life cycle of technology and thinking, how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be? So we'll start with the early development stage, the early advice stage. So we're going to go to Alicia and to Nicholas to give us some thoughts on that. So thank you.
Thank you. I think there are a lot of opportunities in early development and early advice. We had some experience. There are some experience already in Europe. I remember last year in Rome that we were talking about how to work together, initially HTAi, regulatory and industry, of course including patients, and it was seen as an opportunity to create a platform, a common platform for doing this. And yesterday, I had a panel in which I have Canadian, European, and it comes up spontaneously why we not collaborate in that sense in a more global way. There are actors, there are people knowing how to do it. It's not easy, but having a public-private multi-stakeholder platform for doing such thing, probably we cannot do with every single product, but now it's a lot of new science coming, a lot of new challenges that we will not solve with the traditional schemes of assessment, and deliberation. There is a lot of room for having deliberation, science and deliberation with this new science coming. If we work on this, everyone at home, it will be very difficult. It is difficult anyway. But if we have a common platform for debating and for making some joint decisions, this is my vision.
Great, thank you very much. So we'll go to Nicholas to give us some further thoughts on that early advice, early development stage.
So I would just echo what has been said, and I think there are some projects that are studying in details how we should actually develop the methodology to make that happen. And so PFMD is one of them. We have another public-private partnership in Europe, IMI Paradigm, who is focusing on some key decision points. And so the idea, and that's a nuance I would like to bring from what I just heard, patient engagement is not only engaging with patient to get the first insight, it's also working with the patient expert. And so part of the methodology is actually to find the right balance at the right time to actually work with the patient experts that really can translate the patient need into something more linked to research or to evidence, and then how they do build the representation and the evidence beyond the statement as experts. And so that's really the methodology that are working on for the moment, and there are modules, activity per activity, that are developed.
Great, thank you very much. So I want you to be thinking of comments and questions probably in relation to each of these stages. We're not going to, we're going to have like a general sort of open conversation towards the end. But we're going to go through each stage of this of the cycle, the life cycle of technologies. So we're going to go next to the early advice stage, and Maureen is going to speak.
Thank you. Well, I think when it comes to early advice, it's very obvious that for us to be efficient at HTAi, we need the developers to provide us with the evidence that we need in order to provide a robust health technology assessment and then follow-on appraisal. And then in recognition of that, for a number of years now, both the regulators and the HTAi agencies have been involved in providing early advice, and it's very well received, I think. And in UNATA, the European Network of HTAi, we have a work package which is focused on early advice. It's led by HAS and GBA, and it's oversubscribed at this stage. Basically, the demand outweighs the capacity. And we can see the obvious benefits of it, but I think there's probably something we need to think about in terms of efficiency there, though, because obviously if we dedicate HTAi assessment expertise to early advice, then the opportunity cost for that is, you know, less capacity available for assessment. So we need to think about, So we need to think in that kind of space. But I think there are opportunities for efficiencies, and based on the learnings from all of that work, that we can figure out, you know, high-level frameworks whereby they're dedicated around, say, groups of technologies in indications, and we don't have to do the in-depth one-to-one early advice for every single technology that's coming to the market. But in that whole kind of space, I think there's a challenge now that I want to put maybe to the industry, and it is that, yes, we absolutely do want you to generate robust evidence that we can use for assessment, but, you know, there is a point when enough is enough. And there is, I think, a tipping point, and Conor Tellier and my team did some work last year where he looked at the sequential provision of evidence around a particular technology. And when you get to a particular point, you know, there's a law of diminishing returns kicks in. So while it might be good in terms of socialising an intervention amongst the healthcare system to have, you know, numbers and numbers of interventionist-led studies, I think there is a point where we need to be careful about that resource as well that the industry has, because increased resources translates into increased prices at the other end. So.
Great, thank you very much. And I think we've got a lot of experience with some of the early advice that's being given in various jurisdictions, so it'd be good to hear different perspectives on that process and how we can have an efficient process. So Alicia is going to make some comments on early... No? Okay. I have you down as giving comments on early advice, but maybe I misread that. Well, if you don't wish to, that's fine.
No, I'm convinced that early advice, I prefer to talk about early dialogues, no? Because we have a lot to say bilateral. We know a lot about the disease, maybe better than sometimes the regulators of the HTAi. So I prefer to use the term dialogues. So this early advice or the early dialogues I think it's a must, and it is the real instrument in which, at least with the new science, we can go further. I don't want to go more than I said already.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you very much. So now we're going to move to the adoption phase, which of course is the phase that has largely been the focus of health technology assessment work. Whenever I sort of see the word adoption, I always think of that paper which was it Breaking the Addiction to Technology Adoption? I never remember who, was it someone, Dr. Sterling or something, I think was, yeah, right. Anyway, we're going to focus on that adoption question and how do we ensure efficiency in the HTAi ecosystem in relation specifically to that adoption piece. So, Robin, I have you down to say something on this.
Thanks, Sterling. And again, I would hate to try to suggest what you people should do about making it efficient at that stage, because I'm not qualified for that. But on adoption in general across the ecosystem, can I nudge that? I think it's been said already, but having the right questions asked so that we all understand who needs what when, and from the regulatory perspective, for many reasons, having those dialogues really early. I've heard one very experienced methodologist, a regulator from another jurisdiction, fairly recently say to me, the rhetorical question of, do people know what really good planning can do for you? And that sounds obvious maybe, but we don't necessarily plan as well as we could. And I see in a lot of even early discussions, we sort of gloss over, we're starting to get to sometimes asking the question, but then we just rush to what we think the study design should look like. And we don't actually go back to check, okay, did that design, the way you've structured it, actually look like it was designed to actually answer those questions for those people? I don't know if we do a lot of double checking. So, and I would hate to think again that we're just sort of going through the motions and rushing, and then at the back end going, well, that's not what we needed. I mean, I can tell you as a regulator, there are times that it's unfortunate, but you may not like your evidence outcomes just because you don't like the performance metrics, but there's at least as much of the time that your evidence is not super interpretable for many different reasons. I think, again, this is echoing session one. And the uncertainties there, it would be really wonderful to put more effort into figuring out how to make those studies look. And also understanding you can't necessarily plan everything and know every step because, and I see this in many dialogues, people assume there'll be a positive outcome for this stage, and then they just automatically assume what the next study will look like, and you just kind of go on that track. You almost need to have a strategic approach to the outcome of this critical study could look like this or this, and depending on which way it goes, you need to rethink or have some options ready for what the next step would look like. So you need to be able to adapt around that as well in a nimble fashion with all those critical people to make sure that design looks right. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you very much, Robin. And actually, one of the things I hadn't really sort of thought about in this context, but maybe sort of being efficient in process with early advice, is at what point do you start talking about price? Because, I mean, if you don't start talking about price early, then you are going to potentially waste a lot of resource and analytic time and effort. Because if you find that actually I mean, typically we expect things to work and work well, but if we don't actually have a sense of how much we're going to have to pay, then it's difficult to know how well does it really need to work in order for it to be something that can be given a positive endorsement. So yeah, I mean, I would put that question on the table as well. If we're going to have an efficient process, then if we possibly also need to start talking price early. Anyway, enough of me. Maureen is going to speak to this.
Thank you. Well, I suppose in the context of adoption and the role of HTAi and conduct of assessment to inform those adoption decisions, in Europe, inspired by, I suppose, some great leaders in the field, we've been working together collaboratively for the last 15 years or so in the context of UNATA, the European Network of HTAi, to standardise our processes, to drive quality and to harness the opportunities and the efficiencies that are possible for HTAi agencies to work together and to collaborate. And it's a really important time actually for us at the moment, because many of you will know that the European Commission has brought forward a proposed regulation on HTAi, and it's a really important time for those of us who can see the benefits in European HTAi collaboration to make that, to make that known, and make that known to the people who will be involved in making the decisions around it. But I suppose at this conference I was really interested yesterday to learn how the outputs from that collaboration have been used in a number of European HTAi agencies in order to streamline their processes and to, real kind of tangible examples of generating efficiencies. But what was probably even more exciting was to hear from other countries, other continents, from South Africa, from Kazakhstan, how they intend to use the UNATA core model and the UNATA methodologies that have been developed in order to develop their HTAi function. So, you're really seeing kind of the efficiencies of the work, done once and then used often, if you like, kind of across the HTAi ecosystem. And of course, Canada has been a huge supporter as well in terms of this collaborative working, and Canada very kindly seconded Michelle Mushimdura to come and work with us in UNATA for the first half of the joint action. So we were very grateful for that, very grateful to Brian and Tammy for that. But I just think these are all examples of how the HTAi agencies working together, we really can generate those efficiencies. Like we have done a lot, but we have a lot more to do.
So I love the phrase like develop once or build once and then use lots of times. I mean, it just seems, why wouldn't we do that? It's like building bridges, not walls, seems to be like a bit of a theme, and I would again emphasize the importance of, if we've got good work that's been done in other jurisdictions, let's at least use that as a starting point. It may not be what we have to use eventually, but it at least provides a great starting point. And why aren't we sharing models? Anyway, that's a topic for yesterday, not today. But maybe we'll come to that as well. So now we're going to move to the real-world performance of technologies, which I think is a fascinating area. And we've seen some presentations on this topic. And I think it does link to the profound and insightful comment that we had earlier on learning health systems. And why do we do HTAi and we don't link HTAi to the healthcare system very effectively? And if we actually had learning health systems, then we would be potentially making some judgments about how well technologies are performing. I've got this fear that because we don't really monitor it, how well technologies perform, I've got this fear that, that typically they don't perform terribly well, or at least they don't perform as well as we expected them to perform when we did our analyses. And that's just maybe I try and be a glass half full person, and I typically am, but maybe in that I'm a bit doubtful. So real world performance. Nicholas is going to talk to us about real world performance of technologies. Thank you.
So I'll be brief. I was about to build on the same line as you've just done. So I also think that there is a great opportunity there to actually build a learning system. The technology is moving very fast. So probably when we talk about, we move to the management element, but we can also talk about agility. Because if we can have a learning system and then react much faster because of that, actually we can accelerate the innovation part. So I think it's not only an opportunity to manage, but also to become much more agile and to accelerate innovation. So that's a very important point. Very often when we talk about that, we talk about device data, and I think it's also the opportunity to learn from the input from patient together with that. So there's a quality element to it. Very often it's sidetracked in the discussion. So that's the only 2 points.
Very important points. Thank you very much indeed. And then Robin is going to speak to this as well.
Yeah, thanks for the perspectives on the patient point of view. And to echo again that insightful comment about the learning healthcare system. We too, as regulators, are really interested in that. I'm dismayed to sometimes hear how often people think, and again, I'm just talking with my regulator hat here, how regulators just, want those kinds of studies that are irrelevant to people and make no difference. And I'm just going to do my little pitch on randomized control studies as one kind of evidence we look at. Don't necessarily have to be the opposite of real-world studies. I think the opposite of real world is contrived world, not necessarily RCT. And I'm hoping regulators are moving from just wanting contrived stuff. So I think, and we've talked about this about trying to build in as much as we can understand about the real world into the studies of whatever kind all the way along. But I think also we're at a really exciting time / terrifying time where there's so many innovations happening all at the same time that are massive, and they're not coordinated. So we're all trying to, navigate this landscape and try not to sort of step on any slippery rocks. So it's still not clear exactly what that's going to look like, but I think in this time of transition, sort of multi-dimensional transition, the more we can think about the opportunities ahead that may come to us, instead of just focus on the past negative stuff, with a clear-sighted awareness of what could go wrong, would be really helpful as we try to understand, social and digital health. All these things could be really helpful if we can get it out to the patients so they can make their decisions best, but then get their feedback back in for the whole learning healthcare system.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed. And then we're going to come to the final one, which is the most challenging, is how do we actually stop doing things? How do we actually disinvest or de-adopt? I mean, we've got a whole vocabulary now of different words that basically mean something very painful, which is like stop doing something, like take it out of the system. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to ask all of our speakers just to speak very briefly on this. So you're the kernel of how do we do this? But please keep it tight. So we'll start at the end, and then we'll just go along the panel if that's okay.
Okay, I think this investment is crucial in order to make room for innovation. But we have to be careful in which to disinvest, because we are focusing in the 20% of the healthcare expenses, sometimes only medicines. And what about the 80% that we are not looking at the same scrutiny? So I would suggest that yes, for this investment, but make clear priorities in which to disinvest.
I'm going to hark back to the evidence uncertainty issue, and when you're trying to make an adjustment, you need to have adequate evidence upon which to make that decision. And the general approach has been, when there's doubt, that you don't change the status quo. So who gets the benefit of the doubt? So I'm a firm believer of trying to manage that uncertainty to very focused approaches, so you can truly try to signal confirm, even in the real world, so you can enable those discussions and decisions.
So just building on the fail fast discussion that happened recently in the forum. So I think if we talk more about redirecting investment, it's like a less negative element. And since we talk about an agile learning system, then redirecting the investment to something better should be actually a much nicer and much more constructive discussion. So that's just a small point.
I very much agree, actually, with the point that you have to be very careful about what you're talking about when it comes to disinvestment, and also that point about the difference in the approach to drugs and then to non-drugs, and particularly, I suppose, coming from my perspective, where we mainly assess public health interventions or other interventions in the context of national programs. And while Alicia is right, we don't actually spend enough of our HTAi resources assessing non-drugs. But I think the reality, at least certainly in our country, is that the threshold for drugs is much higher than what it is for non-drugs. So if we were to put them all in an even playing field, it's kind of one of those, be careful what you wish for.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So I think we've been given quite a rich buffet of food and some very tasty delicacies that were part of the panel. So we're open for conversation at this point. So for people who have, and actually the bar is a little lower, so it doesn't have to be super insightful and super profound at this point, but we will have time for comments. So please form an orderly queue behind the two mics, and I'll try and go in order. I think we were over here first. Thanks. Maybe say who you are and where you're from.
Chris Henshaw, I'm independent consultant. This might be a comment for the wrong session, as it were, but some comments in the last round of discussion sort of triggered my thinking, and I guess my thinking is that however efficiently we do something, if it's not the right thing, it doesn't, it's not helpful. And I guess I'm thinking of the definition of HTAi, which is supposed to include all technologies defined as interventions in healthcare. And I'm thinking of HTAi in practice in many situations, which is pretty well only drugs and devices, and in many systems, not most of them either. And I'm kind of thinking from the health system point of view and the patient point of view, who wants the most efficient and the highest quality system, is it efficient to run an HTAi system that is so selective in terms of what it looks at? So.
Very, very interesting questions. What I'm going to suggest is that we take a number of contributions and then we'll get the panel to reflect upon them. Just a reminder that a key definition of a question is it actually has a question mark at the end. So, and yours did, sorry, I don't want to, but yeah, if we like comments short and then questions, that would be very helpful. Thanks.
So, thank you very much. Ken Steen from the University of Exeter in the UK. I want to make a couple of observations, and there may or may not be questions in them. The first one, I think, is that I wanted to object to your dividing up the process into steps, because in my view, the efficiency of a system is often determined by the links between the elements in it. And so that was just an observation, a critical observation, but meant in a warm way. The second thing I think is important in an ecosystem is extinction, and so I think Robin made a really important point, which may bear further discussion, which is when you're not sure how things are going to go, you have to stop doing something. So at each point in the process, allowing things to become extinct is really important, and that will improve the efficiency of the whole system. The last point I wanted to make was about implementation, de-implementation. I think we're in danger of making a real mess of this by talking about disinvestment, stopping things. It's the flip side of encouraging things to happen. And the big problem, it seems to me, is that we don't have the right information about who is getting the technologies. It's the indication problem. Once a technology has more than one indication, it becomes increasingly difficult to see who is getting it and for what reasons. So within the system, having the right information about who is to where the technology is being delivered is critical in order to make sure that it's achieving the best benefit for public health. I don't think that was a question. Sorry, Stuart.
Interesting contribution, Dave. Thank you very much. And that was Ken Steen from the University of Exeter, for those who don't know Ken. Over here, please.
Hopefully I'll remember to make a question.
Could you tell us who you are? Thanks.
My name is John Gillespie. I work with Medtronic in Australia. I'm a HTAi consultant. I've worked in HTAi for about 14 years. I often think in work, it's not what we do, it's how we approach problems is the way we find answers. And I'm going to quote quite a well-known chap, Albert Einstein here. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them, right? So I guess an example of that is someone's sick, a surgeon will operate, a physio will give them physio. You know what I'm saying, right? So I really think we need to look outside health. What other areas can we bring in to help us fix these really complex problems? I used to be a primary school teacher in one of my previous careers. We all learn and think in different ways. This thing up here is wonderful. So what else can we do to approach the way we solve these complex problems? Great. That was a question, wasn't it?
It was a profound comment, I think, actually. So I think, and actually, I think when it comes from someone with a Scottish accent, it actually has more resonance. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Thanks, Sterling. Now that the bar is lower, I can come with my non-profound question. I thought you started with a very interesting question about whether we're disastrously inefficient, moderately inefficient, or not inefficient, and the distribution of responses was interesting. I'd be curious to know the panel's views on whether we are collectively under-resourced, because it's possible to be moderately inefficient, which was sort of the majority view, and yet under-resourced. I'd be curious to know folks' views on that question mark.
Great, thanks very much. So we'll go to the panelists to comment on any of the contributions that have been made. Who wants to go first? Thank you very much, Maureen.
You're You're welcome, Sterling. Well, anything to stop you doing the next thing, you know, when it comes to us exercising up here on the stage. Okay, well, one of the comments, I suppose, that struck me from early on in the conversation and then kind of Ken made me think about it again, is this whole concept of extinction. And, you know, if you run out of road, maybe you need to stop. And actually, you know, maybe where we're going with HTAi is that we're going towards extinction, because if we had a truly learning health system, you don't need us as a distinct entity. We're just part of it. So maybe that is something to be thinking about, that we need to feed into that. You know, it's a whole new paradigm that's potentially evolving there. If our HTAi system is so selective, is it efficient to have us at all? I mean, I think it is actually, but I think that goes back to my point earlier about risk-based health technology assessment. I think we have to pick the key questions that we direct our resources towards answering, so that we are actually generating value. It's not about doing HTAi on every single intervention. It's about doing it, you know, where it really matters. And then, are we under-resourced? I don't think so, actually. I think it's about, I think as a system, as an ecosystem, I think we have enough resources. I think we definitely have enough intellectual capacity. I think it's about harnessing it and focusing it to deliver best value.
Great, thanks very much. Any of the panelists want to pick up on any of the items that were raised? I am, just as a warning, I'm going to ask for a Kaiser Permanente perspective on this topic at some point. So if I'm not looking at anyone in particular, but yeah.
Here to the can we learn from other areas, and let's see if we can do that to that point. And then on the under-resourcing, I agree in many ways with Maureen. We have so much new stuff coming, and I know that we're looking at this as a regulator. How are we going to have the expertise to deal with 3D printing and, you know, all these things that are hitting us? But in addition, I think there are a lot of inefficiencies in all, I can certainly speak to, in our system, and perhaps it's not just more of, but a redistribution of the effort along the way in a strategic way. Yeah, figuring out how to do that is another issue, but I do agree on the redistribution where possible.
Yeah.
And, oh, sorry. Go ahead. No, it's just linking with this redistribution, but also we have learned in healthcare always we are under resources, so we have to make choices and make priorities, and it is very context dependent.
So maybe just to build on the point to look outside of the health system, I think it's an outsider perspective, and so it comes with naivety from my side too. But so I've been in many discussions for the last 3 days where, as an outsider, it seems that the problem that you face are problems created within the HTAi ecosystem. We discussed about early dialogues and the contract signed with the companies and how many constraints it puts. And I understand the constraints, but as a patient, as an outsider, as an economist, you can change that. And actually, when you discuss with industry, the thought leader in industry, actually they see that more and more patient engagement is becoming a competitive advantage. So you want to make it transparent, you want to communicate about it, you want to build a relationship with patients so they will have a stronger voice and more credible voice when they will come and participate to the discussion. So there are things, I think there is looking to completely different industries or sectors, but there is also looking outside of the HTAi and away from the HTAi created problem. That's one. Two, on the efficiency part, I think we really have to differentiate the methodology that you use from the way you operate. And I think the margin for progress for me is the way HTAs are operating, sometimes competing or duplicating the work, which field they are active on or not. So there is a lot of things on the operation model that can be changed, which is different from the methodology front. And so on the resource, I think I don't know anybody that will tell me that he has enough resource to do his job. I don't know that. And on the patient side, it's even worse. So I don't think it should be a criterion to discuss. It's the reality of everybody out there.
Great. Often we look at Kaiser Permanente as one of our high-performing healthcare system models that we try to learn from and build from. So thank you, Murray, for offering to just share a thought or two on this issue.
I should learn never to sit in plain view of the moderator. Murray Ross with Kaiser Permanente, and I actually don't work in the HTAi operations. Liz Lofgren, my colleague, is here, and if she wants to get up and weigh in, she's certainly welcome to do that. I think from our perspective, if you ask the people in any piece of sort of the assessment and deployment and follow-up process, all of them individually would say, yes, we're under-resourced, we can always use more. But I think, looking at, systemically for the organization, we're getting pretty much the right balance between what we're doing on the HTAi side, what we're thinking about as we deploy things, what kind of information we're capturing and recirculating the real-world evidence. And we have a pretty strategic approach to what are the topics we choose. High impact, high cost. Are there alternatives that we can look into? What I can't help you with, Sterling, is yes, I think we are an exemplar of sort of high-performing health system, but the journey of how do you get there is still the question on the table. Does that help?
That's very helpful. Thanks very much. And actually, I think it is that learning health system approach and actually fitting HTAi and HTM in the context of learning health systems, I think is for me like one of the big takeaways that we need to reflect upon and think through and learn from. What was the phrase? An exemplar learning health system? Is that what you said? Yeah, Kaiser Permanente as an exemplar, and clearly they're doing tremendous work. So I'd like to close the session, I think we're just about on time, by making reference to the hashtag No More Manels. So Andre Picard has made a particular point, who's the Globe and Mail health correspondent on Twitter. Hashtag No More Manels is no more all-male panels, so congratulations to HTAi for not falling into the trap of no more manels, and I think we had an excellent discussion from an excellent panel here. And then the final thing I would like to say as a point of congratulation to HTAi is actually to have a session that was on HTA and Indigenous health. I think like the biggest, in a Canadian context and probably in other jurisdictions as well, the biggest health disparity that we see is between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. Something like a 20-year difference in life expectancy, which is just shocking and something that we need to do something about. And I'm so pleased that the Health Technology Assessment International Conference saw fit to actually have a session that was focused on that. And I think we all should reflect on how can we contribute to reducing that disparity and inequality. So I would like you to join me in saying a very, very big thank you to all of our panelists, and please stay seated for the next session, which will start straight away. But thank you very much.